when we combine the story around tech with popular dominant narratives around the teen brain, and then we bring those together, it can really, really close down conversation and curiosity as opposed to kind of opening that up. When I think about adolescence, it's really a period of discovery. It's truly a period of development, not just a period of, impulsive risk-taking.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
There's a lot of talk about tech and teens.
Really? I hadn't noticed.
If you hadn't heard. But this is a conversation unlike any we've had before. It's a really interesting look at how adults can think about tweens, teens, and screens. And it gets into all of the little subtle cracks and spaces between the data that we know about and that we have espoused a ton on this podcast, and the data that does not exist, Vanessa, that the world wants to believe exists, but it's not there. So I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, Erin Walsh is our guest today, and one of the things I love about Erin is when she admits that we don't yet have the data or the research to come down on one side or the other. And in a world where people are willing to make huge proclamations based on tenuous connections, Erin is the opposite. Her attention to the research and what we know is so rigorous that it makes for such a healthy and rich conversation. She's the co-founder of the Spark and Stitch Institute, and her book that we're going to talk about is called It's Their World, Teen Screens and the Science of Adolescence. And I want to underline with Sharpie the Science of Adolescence, because much of this conversation is truly about what we know and understand about adolescents, about their brains, about their development, and how that allows us to forge ahead in figuring out their relationship to tech.
And if you need one reason beyond everything we've just said to stay on and listen, it's the conversation we get into about what life would look like without tech and what the science shows there. It's fascinating. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, Erin. It's so nice to have you here.
It is such a thrill to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're friends on Instagram, which I say, a little tongue in cheek, but also because this is a conversation about teens and tech and how we treat them and how we get into conversation with them. And it's really easy to be judgmental and it's really easy to go negative. And yet, just as we adults have friendships and colleagues that we build on tech, so too are there positive things that come out of teens' tech use. So that is the point from which we are having this conversation. Are we all agreed, Erin and Cara, that that is where we are beginning from? Not a place of major anxiety, major stress, major fear mongering. We're coming at it from a balanced point of view. Yes.
Let's go. Yes.
Hurrah.
Yes.
Huzzah.
Yeah. And that doesn't, let's just acknowledge that takes a little effort to get to that place.
I'm not going to use the profanity. It takes a beep ton of effort
to
this
do
is
no small lift.
Yes. Which is why you're here and why it's worth devoting an episode to this conversation.
But we just do have to have a moment to honor the irony of where and how you met.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
No,
Let's
that's
just
exactly
take a
right.
moment of silence.
Yes.
Okay. Huzzah.
But think about how many people, Cara, how many work colleagues and now friendships we've built with people because we initially met them on Instagram.
And we're old. Can you imagine how the young
this
people
is not
do
the
this?
central social ecosystem?
And we're
Exactly.
old and not tech savvy and trying to figure out how to use Slack. So you can tell exactly.
For instance.
For example. Yes,
just
I did
random
just sign
example.
Okay. So let's level set here, Erin, before we go into the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
Which is we want to engage teens about everything from a place of respect, right?
Yeah.
All of the research tells us that that is the most effective way to connect to teens, to guide teens, so on and so forth. Knowing that, as we approach a conversation about tech use, what are some overarching principles that you can offer up as like big tent framing for this conversation for adults to think about how they go into these conversations with teens about tech?
Yeah, I love that question. And of course, for your listeners, and given both of your contributions to the world, this is going to be no surprise that one of our first tools in our toolkit is to access that place of curiosity. And that's not an easy thing to do sometimes around technology, because we tend to have preformed stories about what the presence or absence of a device or presence or absence of a screen around an adolescent means. We tell a very fast story about that, and accessing some of our curiosity to let our adolescents or the young people we care for author a little bit of that story and acknowledge that it's not just as simple as sort of presence of screen equals bad. So I think curiosity and that non-judgmental stance, which is true across so many topics, but deeply true, of course, around technology and young
Before
people.
you keep going, what are some of the quote stories
Yeah.
or non-curious, curious, judgmental versions of that story can you think of? Because I got a long list of stuff that has come out of my mouth. And I'm curious, Erin, the sort of what not to do. And then we'll keep going on what to do. We don't like to go negative, but we're just sort of like setting the scene here.
Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of broad stories that are really dominating our conversations around adolescence and technology. And one is this idea that sort of dose for dose, ounce for ounce, any amount of time with tech sort of equals an inevitable decline in mental health, in well-being, and all things good for young people. So this is sort of like teens plus screens equals bad, that just sort of permeates the air around our interactions with young people. And I think following that is this idea that a good, quote unquote, good parent then's job is to protect young people from screens, and that the quote unquote best parent would have screen time 0. Like those two stories are strong and powerful and can quickly put us into what are you doing on that thing? What bad thing must you be doing? What nefarious activities are you up to, or harmful content are you viewing? Or what a bad parent am I that I have come into your room or come into the living room and there you are with a screen. So there's a lot of feelings that are running hot around young people in tech.
That's a brilliant framing. And I want to restate it, because I think if this is all that people get out of this episode, this might be enough. I mean, we're going to get at it in lots of different directions, but this idea of what we in medicine call a dose-dependent relationship, that there is a belief that the more screen time you have, the more toxic, right? That the higher the dose, the worse. And you did this math equation, teens plus screens equals bad. So I'm going to offer up then teens plus 2x screens equals 2x bad. And teens plus 5x screens is probably 20x bad. And this math, you are going to argue, is not correct.
Yeah, I think the reality is that it flattens what is a nuanced and complicated set of activities. That the same screen that can be a portal to harmful content or hate content can also be a portal to connection and learning, or just taking a little break from a busy day. There's so much happening on screens that when I look at the data, we could talk about the sort of broad population associations, and there's a lot to be concerned about. There's a lot to pay attention to. But when it comes to the young person living in our home or sitting in our classroom, or that this living, breathing human that we're in relationship with, their own outcomes are a lot more complicated. It depends on who they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it, what else is getting crowded out, what access to supports they have. It just gets a lot more messy when we're talking about an individual young person.
I mean, such a simple analogy is, if we think about our kids starting to drive, right? And the car is an absolute weapon. There's no question. And yet we are able to have nuanced conversations to teach kids how to drive, to empower them with not just the ability to, but the responsibility that goes along with. We do this in a lot of different directions in our
we
life.
have experience. I love
Yes.
that. I love that reminder sometimes for parents where it's like, this whole new ecosystem. We have no idea what's going on. And there are certainly, it's moving quickly. And there's a lot that feels unfamiliar. But we do know a lot about what helps adolescents move into spaces that have a lot of risk and what helps them succeed in those spaces.
So let's keep going down this path a little bit, Erin. So we've got curiosity, we've got nuance, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like approaching it not with the you suck and I failed and everybody's like equivalently affected, but like, hey, we've got to make space for the kids and the family and the reality. So some nuance. What's a third kind of principle that you like to think about as you approach teens on this issue?
Yeah, I think the other thing that we can add to this lens is around adolescence in general. And maybe this is a little too broad, Vanessa, so we can sort of get closer into the weeds of what it looks like in individual conversations. But I think in general, there's also this story about adolescents that their brains are broken until they're 25. They're impulsive. They're not to be trusted. And they're just built to take risks. And therefore, again, our job becomes to protect, to control. And I think that's not fair to young people either. And I think that does shape our stance. So when we combine the story around tech with the popular dominant narratives around the teen brain, and then we bring those together, it can really, really close down conversation and curiosity as opposed to kind of opening that up. When I think about adolescence, and I write about this in the book, it's really a period of discovery. It's truly a period of development, not just a period of, impulsive risk taking.
Right. And you quote early on in the book, you quote Ellen Galinsky, who came on the podcast, who's so brilliant. And she likes to reframe the stage of life as a time of opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we're going to get into that more as we talk about how to manage this complicated topic. But before we do that, Erin, there are some folks screaming at us through the headlines, through the news, through our social media that are really scaring the crap out of us. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as someone who's so steeped in this work, what impact do you think that's having? What impact do you think it's having on kids? What impact do you think it's having on parents and caregivers and educators?
Yeah, well, I don't know about you both, but when I think about my own parenting life, so I have a 6th grader and a 9th grader. And when I parent from a place of fear, I am not showing up as my best self usually. Like after I watched the Netflix, the show Adolescence, that next week was like it was like if somebody was filming me, it would be an example of how fear shapes our stance and our approach with our kids. Like when we are terrified and when we feel like we are walking on this tightrope and one wrong move and the whole thing falls apart and the internet will just eat our kids, we tend to grab some pretty reliable tools or some sort of go-tos that we think are going to help. And when we're scared, we tend to go to control. We tend to go towards limits and lectures. We tend to go towards protection. I don't want to throw out limits by all means, but when that's the only tool in our toolkit, it tends to come at the cost for adolescents of one of the biggest protective factors, which is our relationship with them. That I think the steady drumbeat of fear makes us feel like we are truly at one wrong parenting decision away, one app away from really catastrophic results. And that makes it hard to go in and have a curious stance and tell me about your favorite, who's your favorite YouTuber? And, I heard this thing. What do you think of it? Like when we are scared, we are position ourselves often as what I call on-off regulators. Like our job is to turn things off, and the best parent just walks around protecting them from that.
Right. And when you pull the lens back and you think about it sort of in a more global sense, then there is another kind of on-off or analog way of viewing this, which is, well, if you don't want me to control everything, I will control nothing. Right.
Yeah.
And that is its own false truth, right?
Yeah.
Because being curious by definition means you're very much in there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're just not,
Yeah.
your hands are not controlling the steering wheel at all times, but
Yeah.
you're trying to guide. Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like let's use the example of adolescence, which you are certainly not alone. 3 for 3 of us finished that. First of all, we binged it. And
Yep.
second of all, and we dreaded it while we were binging it.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
Yeah, it was powerful and beautifully filmed,
beautiful,
and
like
beautifully
amazing.
acted,
all of the
yeah,
things, and terrifying,
painful, very
and
scary.
we finished it. Your youngest and my oldest are separated by a decade, and yet we all had the same reaction to it, which was, oh my God, I got to get in there and I've got to do all these things and cut off all of these toxic streams.
Yeah.
And that is not wrong in the sense that there are things that we can start talking about and being in conversation around all that. But what does that look like when it comes from a place of curiosity instead of a place of control?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that this example of when we come in with that predetermined story. And I think that what it looks like when we're scared, I love that you brought up this. Sometimes we just hands off. We're like, I'm good luck. Here's a phone. Close my eyes, cross my fingers, and see you when you're 25. I really hope this works out because it's too much.
Mhm.
It's totally I can't keep up. It's a full-time job. And then we've already talked about those control-based strategies. And I think one of the powerful tools in our toolkits after you watch a show like Adolescence, and I think it sounds like we share a lot of feelings about that, beautiful, powerful, deeply terrifying, is to take a deep breath, take 5 or 6 more. And do our very best to approach our kids with questions that actually reflect that we don't have the story written already. And it can even be, I watched this documentary, or I watched this show, or I saw this article, or I read this thing, and it made me realize I haven't asked you about this in a while. Are your friends talking about this at all? Do you have thoughts about this at all? What would you say to a younger kid about this kind of thing? These kinds of ways that we can get at what they're thinking about that isn't, I heard the statistic that this is going to happen online. Are you listening to this podcaster? Because if you are, you're grounded for a month, this sort of, I have this story and it's my job to sort of protect you versus figure out what's going on for them.
How does brain development factor into all of it? When you're having that exact conversation with a 12-year-old versus with a 20-year-old?
Well, I think when we think about 20-year-olds are probably a lot more capable of thinking about this in sort of abstract ways. They're probably thinking about this in terms of their place in the world, how they might take action. Something like, what are we thinking about the manosphere online or online influencers? As kids get older, they're able to sort of contextualize their own experiences in this broader thought landscape. They're really likely to be able to engage in a conversation in sort of these more nuanced ways. But 12-year-olds have a lot to say about these things as well. But we aren't probably going to expect to be able to sit down and have, a long, thoughtful dialogue about the role of masculinity influencers. But we can ask questions that are a little more concrete. Hey, have you ever heard of this? Has anybody ever talked to you about this? What questions do you have? Those kinds of questions that we can ask a 12-year-old who's their social world is sort of just starting to expand. They have all of this incredible transformation happening where their emotions are becoming more intense. They are just at the time that their digital world is expanding and they're starting to be much more tuned into what their peers are doing. So even if they aren't listening to certain podcasts, starting to understand what are kids talking about on the bus and what are kids talking about at school that you may or may not totally understand, but might have some questions about.
Right. So just because they don't have a nearly mature brain doesn't mean they can't participate in sort of thoughtful, incisive conversations, but we have to figure out what their starting point is, and we got to get some shared vocabulary. When we think about brain development, Erin, and we won't spend a ton of time on this here because we've done it in a bunch of different ways, but I want to get to some specific corners of brain development that you explore in the book, and that I think is actually we haven't covered in depth before. And that is the impact of dopamine and the relationship between dopamine and tech use and kind of what that looks like and how it progresses in an adolescent brain. And I think a place to start is sort of like, what impact does it have, right? What's happening with dopamine? And then we can explore like how different pathways a kid is choosing might then take them down a certain road.
You know, one of the things we know about adolescents is that they're especially sensitive to rewards. So they have this sort of hopped up reward system. So their dopaminergic pathways, right? Those feedback loops are more sensitive not just to, you know, any kind of rewards, but especially social rewards, which becomes very important to their development. So sometimes we think of this again in this negative story about adolescents, like, oh my gosh, they're sensitive to rewards. And so therefore, the moment that they get an online reward, there's no going back. It's really good that young people's brains are sensitive to these kinds of rewards because it propels them out into the world. They're out there trying to figure out what feels good, what doesn't feel good. It's very helpful to them as they figure out who am I and where do I belong, to be sensitive to social rewards, to go out and find their people, and to be sensitive to social rejection. So all of that sensitivity, the reward sensitivity, is not a pathology, right? It's not a glitch in development. It's very useful as young people sort of move out to figure out, where are my people? You know, how do I take risks to learn more about what I like and what I don't like, and to test and experiment, which you all talk so beautifully about. So the question then becomes, you know, dopamine is a naturally occurring chemical in the brain. So it's not like TikTok creates dopamine and we could take it away if we wanted to. But there are frictionless rewards that young people are experiencing in online spaces that can be especially salient for young people whose brains are more sensitive to that experience. So if we think about dopamine occurring, right? Dopamine makes us feel good. It's a pleasurable feeling. When I got on this podcast and you smiled and said hello, I felt that felt good. When I look at, you know, a beautiful, the trees are turning here in my home. And that is also a reward. So the reason I bring that up is because sometimes I think when we're talking about young people and dopamine, it's almost as if TikTok is the only place where young people find it, as if we could sort of do dopamine fasting or things like that. And I think we want to be really careful about the science and thinking really thoughtfully about this also, so that we don't tell this story that because of dopamine, all young people are addicted to their devices. We don't see that in the data, but we should be really thoughtful about the fact that our devices are designed to grab and hold our attention. And our devices are designed to deliver frictionless rewards and especially designed to give us frictionless social feedback and social rewards. And that can intersect with this reward sensitivity that's naturally occurring in adolescence in ways that for some young people can be really hard for them to unplug, or can make those sort of tech transitions or resisting tech rewards more challenging.
I want to push on the term frictionless because it's really interesting. You're someone who uses that word a little more often than others, and I appreciate it. It's not just sort of having access to these things and having the sort of common final pathway be that your brain squirts a little dopamine out there and it feels good. It's that it's easy to access these things and your brain does this. So, you know, if we think about sort of something in any of our lives that we worked hard to get, and how good it felt. And then we think about something where we didn't work that hard to get it, but it felt really good, right? Generationally, I do wonder if there's a difference, because for me, and maybe it's just the voice of my grandparents in my head, but the thing you worked harder to get was supposed to feel better because you worked harder. I don't know that it did. When I listen to you talk, when I read what you've written, I'm left thinking it's all the same common final pathway. And yet we put it through this different lens. I wonder generationally if this frictionlessness, how's that for a word? If that is changing then the value proposition of these various things. Will a generation that can get a dopamine hit really easily because it's right there literally at your fingertips. Will that generation then go on to either feel more joy because they can appreciate the easy things? You're walking down the street, you see a flower, you smell it. Like, is that like literally, or is the exact opposite?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that we fully know exactly, right? This is sort of this, in some ways, a big experiment, which I think can sound a little scary, but I think it's just an acknowledgement that there are some things that might be unforeseen benefits about our ability to access experiences that are connecting and inspiring, and where we can participate in conversations we didn't have access to before. And those sort of pathways to purpose for young people might be really rewarding in ways that aren't just a frictionless quick hit. And there are other things that when we look at cycles of avoidance for adolescents, that's where I start to get a little more concerned, where I hit some friction in something that's a goal that I have, whether it's, learning my lines for the school play, or it's learning, doing my vocab to learn another language so I can speak to my friends who go to school with me. Those things aren't necessarily going to be easy. And I think the question is whether when we start to hit something that's challenging and then we avoid that challenge with something that's less difficult to access that feeling of happiness, I think looking for patterns of avoidance is where we want to make sure that we're holding up some guardrails around that so that we can experience both.
Yeah. I mean, in a very tactical sense, it's like, okay, when is scrolling through TikTok a nice way to have downtime before you dig into your homework? And when is scrolling through TikTok that sort of bufferless reality with constant dopamine hits causing you to avoid things that require ongoing, committed work at something that doesn't offer the same dopamine? I mean, I do something with my kids, which getting back to like sources of dopamine, and I know for the rest of their lives, they will make fun of me for it. And yet, so I'm often in the car with them, either really early in the morning as the sun is coming up or late in the evening as the sun is setting. And, I will say, oh my God, look at the sky. Look how beautiful the sky is. And they kind of make fun of me. They're like, ugh, Mom, it's not even good tonight. Like, why are you even saying that? It's like a B, right? But recently, one of my kids in college has started sending me photos of the sunset.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay. So it makes me think about the ways in which we can teach our kids to find sources of pleasure and joy in the analog ways.
Yeah.
And yes, it makes me feel like a dork. And yes, sometimes I don't get the response I want, but other times I'm like, oh, it actually works. And by the same token, what sort of brain rot behaviors are we practicing ourselves that are modeling for our kids? Like, just keep mindlessly scrolling and not paying attention and sort of like not doing the other stuff. So anything we talk about is, what is it? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I guess what's good for the goose is good for the gosling, or whatever version of that. So sorry, that was like the worst application of that saying.
I think where we're getting though is a reminder, like young people talk about this all the time. They're like, adults are not behaving that well. Like, we're not necessarily modeling the most, what can we say? I love to talk about digital agency, right? Stepping into this sort of like where we're using technology aligned with our values and our goals. We're not necessarily modeling that. And I do think those kinds of questions that you're getting at, whether it's the offline, the analog version of pointing out, finding those sources of awe and joy, and then also asking those questions about their online lives, especially as adolescents get older. What are the experiences that bring you lasting happiness and joy? What are the experiences that feel good in the moment, but fade very quickly? And then where do you spend the most time? And that kind of self-reflection, when we see like, oh, I'm actually spending the most time in the places that bring quick hits, but don't bring lasting happiness, and sometimes get in the way of things that I wish I was doing with my time. it can be helpful for us to just start that process of looking at our own digital lives with some curiosity. Now, is a 12-year-old going to sit down with us for a 30-minute reflective dialogue about their No. Some might, but I think the spirit of that, of starting to ask those questions, both in offline spaces and online spaces, helps us get to that nuance a little bit and helps us get to those reflective, like, TikTok's a place where I think it's going to be good, but it doesn't last, or maybe not.
I'm going to ask you a slightly unfair question, but since you brought up a 12-year-old not being able to have or not being super interested in that 30-minute dialogue, I'd love to understand your personal feelings about readiness and kind of how you go about those conversations, because there's a pretty strong argument that if they're not ready to reflect, maybe they're not ready for the platform. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about readiness for the device itself and separate that from readiness for various platforms.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question, because this is the number one question, right? When I'm in a room with parents and caring adults, it's like, what age should we get these things? And you are likely familiar with the research that's underwhelming to us as caregivers, which is there is no magical age. Like, we have yet to see that there's this shining light in the sky that says every 16-year-old is ready, every 14-year-old is ready. We can't say that that's data driven. What we can say is that there are these windows of sensitivity and vulnerability that early adolescents do appear to be sort of more sensitive to the harms of some of these spaces and of unfettered access, especially to social media. Is that all young people know? But I think we do want to pay attention to these sort of windows. And what that says to me is delay as long as makes sense for your family. But I actually really love thinking about it in terms of developing skills over time with coaching and mentoring. So as opposed to saying,
but Erin, there's nothing clickbaity or sexy about that approach.
It's way less fun. Way less good for the morning shows.
What headline is going to sound good with that? That's so like measured and subtle.
Until skills.
Yes, wait until coach skills. And I think, Cara, you brought up right away this idea of driving, and there's all kinds of other useful places where we've done this. But one of the questions I always ask families is, okay, well, what's the purpose of the device? Like, you're asking, my kid wants this device, or we've identified, is there an agreed upon purpose in the family, right? So, and has that purpose persisted over time? So if it's, I want it because my friend got it, but then that doesn't really persist and it's not really agreed upon, like not everybody in the family is really on board. But let's say another family is like, my kid's biking to school. The purpose is that if they get a flat tire, we no longer have payphones in our environment. And I would like them to be able to figure out how to get in touch with somebody. So we could make an argument. We're also going to teach how to fix bikes and things, but that's a really reasonable, that's a really reasonable purpose. It's persisted over time. And then what's the least amount of technology we can deliver to meet that need that exists in our family? And so that might be the most stripped down version of a device. And maybe it lives at home. Maybe it only goes with them. And we start really, really slow. And I do think, Cara, that having agreements and having conversations. So if we're going to have a really stripped down phone, or we're going to have a watch, or whatever these things are, the least amount of technology we can use to meet this goal as a family, if we can't have any kind of conversation about media agreements, that's tricky. Like, we want to be able to at least have some sort of sense of, here's my responsibilities, here's how we're going to handle tough things, here's how we're going to navigate this.
And your answer to parents who ask, or caregivers who ask, well, my kids are pushing back saying, I need to follow the same rules, but I'm not 10, 12, 14, 16. I'm interested in your take on the sort of two-way street of it all. Especially, given the conversation we just had about how adults are, I think you were very generous in the way you described it. I'm going to be less generous. Horrible. Adults are really
not behaving well.
Not modeling the behavior they are asking their children to demonstrate. I'm wondering, given that, now you hand your kid an agreement and say, these are the terms by which you have to charge your device out of your room. You have to be off at a certain, you can't bring it to the table. You can only be on these apps. By the way, adults follow none of these guidelines. They're adults, but on the other hand, the data is very clear that we would all do better if we all followed these guidelines. So, like, How
we would do better,
you,
and our kids would do better because they're
Right.
watching us more than they're reading some agreement. Like they're
Right.
watching what we do and what we model. So one thing I think we can try to get away from is handing them a long contract and saying, sign on this contract. Here's the 50 things I want you to do. And if you don't do them, here are the consequences, right? That we're really thinking about this as agreements, that we sit down and the kids are participating as well. And we're asking questions, not just what are all the things that could go wrong, but what are the good things we're going to do with this device? Like ideally, we're getting something that's going to bring us value and benefit. And if we don't have anything we can say that's going to bring us value and benefit, it's probably not a good choice right now. And so part of how we can get to that is by, yes, offering up some of our non-negotiables. Like it's a non-negotiable that you're not going to have this near your sleeping area. That's one place where we have really good data. So that's an invitation to parents to think about that being a non-negotiable. There might be other non-negotiables, but also having kids come up with some of those ideas as well. And then what advice or what do they want us to do? And I think parents actually need to step into media agreements, not saying I'm going to have the exact same cell phone life as a 14-year-old. But I should probably be ready to agree to not have my phone at the table or to charge my phone outside my bedroom if I'm asking my kid to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all possible. I think kids are so much more thoughtful about this than we give them credit for, even the younger adolescents. One of the biggest areas of challenge is around the social pressure that kids feel to A, have devices, B, be on certain platforms with those devices, C, have access to devices and those platforms at, varying hours of the day and night. And so with each of those decision points, people listening will likely have run up against everyone else is, or everyone else's parents let them, or, some version of that. And I think the calculus of and we get this question all the time, as Erin, I'm sure you do, which is like, am I ruining my kids' social life? Like I've stuck to my guns. I've been super strict. It's actually clear to me I'm sort of the last man standing on this, or one of the, and I'm worried at this point, my kid is kind of socially ostracized because I've held on for so long, and versions of that. And if I'm being honest, yes, there is a point where, not having access does affect them. So how do you help parents figure out, Erin, when to sort of loosen up a little bit or when limits change? What are the impacts that you look for?
Well, I love that question because it also just respects young people's need to connect.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we're so scared about the tech risks that we really downplay the role of social connection for adolescents, as if it's that's kind of an optional thing, but really we got to be careful that we're not exposing them to toxic tech. Now, that does not mean that we just unleash fully, but I do think we want to take seriously the cost of social isolation. That said, the kinds of things I would encourage is to root that fear in real observations of your kid. So are they saying I'm not connected, but actually they have one or two close friends? We're watching them keep and maintain and build relationships. They are able to find out where and when things are happening and participate in those social things. So watching for how are they doing socially? And then I think one of the other things we can slow roll, if you will, because we just talked about that on the device side, is around the social connection side as well. So sometimes we go from my kid is ostracized and left out to now you're on Instagram, TikTok, and you have a phone. And I think we can also slow down and think about what is a space that we could start. So are we going to be doing a group text that is maybe on my phone first, or maybe it's on a very simple phone where it's only the approved 4 or 5 people? You're starting to get the theme here of training wheels, that it's not all or nothing, and that then we can start looking at how is that helping them stay connected, right? So maybe they're getting a gamer tag of a kid at school and they're playing with that 1 or 2 kids that they know. And that's very different from just sort of unleashing them into the world of Snapchat with 0 guardrails and no monitoring. So I think we watch and see how they're doing and experiment and see if we can get them connected without unleashing everything.
But let me circle back to where we started, which is the question of, if we take the importance of social connection, and we then ask the question again, what's then wrong with the approach of wait until 8th, or what if we could, create a scenario, a utopia, where every parent was on the same page. No kid had logistical issues that required connection and communication that felt insurmountable without a phone. What if all of those pieces were laddering up? Would it be better, all things being equal, to have them off these devices because of that sort of unknown, the wild west of it all of social media? Or is there an argument for having the training wheels on while they're under your roof, having all, seen the show Adolescence and everything else, and knowing that those training wheels can go awry really quickly? But for the parents who, if you're speaking in a community that is a close, tight-knit community where all the parents are best friends and they all talk and they all agree, is the better thing to slow down their access to certain types of platforms? Or is the better thing to try to create training wheels that you can then pull off slowly? Or is there no data?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we have really good, I would be way over my skis to say, well, we have very strong, robust data sets on this versus this and long-term outcomes. The reality is we don't have that. And parenting is so often this wild ride of living in that space between the world as we want it to be and the world as it is.
I don't know what you're talking about, Erin.
Just not landing. You're like totally living in the world as it is. And so I've been in communities where there's a lot of organizing around trying to get every single parent to agree to a specific thing. And honestly, what I hear in a lot of those groups is that it's tricky. It's challenging. And there's some valid reasons that families are not making that same choice. And it doesn't mean they're bad parents, and it doesn't mean their kid is headed towards catastrophic outcomes. So
and it's the argument about vaccines. We can have data about what the risks of vaccines are, but the parents who then choose not to vaccinate are making choices often about only the data set about vaccines, and they're not looking at a data set about the risk of not vaccinating. I think the screen, you could just substitute screens for vaccines. And the only difference is we have a lot more data about vaccines. We don't, right? We don't we know the scary places online. We understand the risks of devices, but I do think we have this Pollyanna view of what life with no screens might be that is not yet supported by any clear body of evidence.
We can get into this assumption that non-screen time is automatically good for kids.
Right.
Like if it's offline, if it's analog, we have great outcomes. And if it's online, we have negative outcomes. It is way more messy than that.
Correct.
When we look at like an isolated adolescent who comes home from school, has no way to connect with peers, no way to participate in things that matter to them, no pathways to purpose, but they're tinkering in something in the analog world. We are not necessarily seeing that young person thriving. So I think we want to be clear that when we say it's nuanced, it doesn't mean we don't know anything. That doesn't mean we don't want clear, purposeful boundaries. Young people want and need something to push against.
Right.
But I think when we think of really rigid, one-size-fits-all solutions, it can be tricky for parents to find their way towards each other, to think about what kids really need, which is a network of caring adults, who are parenting the kid that lives in their house and their own unique family circumstances, and access to supports and their own neurobiology of their kid, which some kids react really differently to devices than others.
Erin, can we talk for a minute about the bell-to-bell bans that are happening across the country, and kind of what you're noticing about how that's impacting the balance of decision-making and limit setting? My kids are in a school that has a bell-to-bell ban. It's been great, honestly. It also feels a lot less stressful to me when they're home and I see them on devices, because I know, okay, so like over the 24-hour period, okay, that I know there's like less happening when they're not in front of me. On the other hand, we work with some educators recently who are like, we work so hard in school to like deal with this ban. And then it feels like the parents are just like letting go during the after school hours, and all this stuff is happening when they're home or not in school. So what are you hearing from people? What seems to be working? What are the continuing challenges that you're noticing?
Yeah, I love this. This is speaking of an experiment, because we have some data anybody who says we have clear, robust data across, that where we know what works, we don't. We're doing our very best to connect the dots. What I'm hearing is that when we think about things like focus, distraction, and attention, that it seems like a lot of educators in particular and young people themselves talk about that this can be really supportive, that having that frictionless off ramp to focus in our pockets, that distraction machine can be helpful in terms of sustaining focus and being present where we are. I think some of the other things we're going to have to wait and see. So the hope, of course, is that we're going to solve the youth mental health crisis, and we're going to reduce and eliminate cyberbullying. I would be wary of thinking that there's going to be one policy that's going to solve all of that. Adolescent mental health is far more complicated than just access to phones during the school day. When I think of bell to bell, I think of that as setting the conditions that set us up for things like focus, for face-to-face interaction, for collaboration with peers. But whether or not that happens is going to come down to great teaching, great schools, good school culture, supporting school mental health and student belonging, connectedness. It's not just going to happen just because the phones are away. So it's going to have to be a both and then we do see there's, at least one or two studies that are looking at, that young people's phone use overall in all scenarios doesn't necessarily plummet when there's a bell-to-bell policy. We make up for it after the school day. So I'm also a parent I just sort of wish it's like, oh, good, screen time problem solved. I can just completely let go because they're not on it during the day. We don't see that totally backed up by the data. And so I think it's a little bit of a release valve. We know they've gotten some face-to-face time. Hopefully that time has been facilitated well. But we still want to be thinking about in those after-school hours, how do we protect the determinants of adolescent mental health? Not just minutes and hours. Talked about screen time is not as useful always around adolescents, but what are they using it for? Why, and what is it crowding out? So still protecting sleep and movement and some sort of purposeful activity that lights them up. Those are still things that we want to make sure screens aren't crowding out after the school day.
Right. And it strikes me that going back to the dopamine hypothesis, if at school, these face-to-face interactions then cause dopamine hits that make them feel good. One of the many conversations we can have at home is a reminder that felt good, that was fun.
Yeah.
That is an easy sort of a layup that reinforces this idea of, oh, if you loved it at school, you might love it after school as well. You want to go join that basketball team or whatever it is,
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is reflection. And we want to make sure that we're not doing the see, I told you so.
Oh, yes.
What feels good and what doesn't feel good? Right. What do you miss about your phone? What do you feel the urge to make up for after school? What are you most eager to check? Why? But I do think what we know is that practice builds confidence, right? Learning how to be in relationship with another person is hard. Being 14 and having a friendship and having a conflict that your parents are not facilitating for you is new. It's hard. It is complicated. It takes practice. So I do think we can point out the ways that that was hard and you figured it out. And what's next? And we can keep trying to find those face-to-face opportunities after school.
Erin, we talked earlier about this stage of life as an age of opportunity, right?
Yeah.
We covered the age of sensitivity. It's also an age of opportunity, which is what I love about Ellen's book, seeing it as the breakthrough years, right? It puts a positive spin on a stage of life that's often viewed as negative. When you think about all the different permutations and all the ways in which kids are trying to navigate this stuff and parents are and educators are, how do we come at it from the perspective of an age of opportunity? What are some things you can leave people with from this conversation where they are like, okay, I can do this and I have faith in my kid. Like, give us a couple of tools or guidance for walking away from this conversation.
Well, let's take this in two. Maybe we'll do the first one is like the hard stuff is still an opportunity. And it's helpful for me as a parent to remember that. So for example, let's say my kid comes home from the playground as a younger kid and they're like, I got into a fight at the play, or we got into an argument. My first reaction to that usually isn't, you will never go to that playground again. Like, you are banned from that playground. Never again. I don't want to hear about it. See, I told you it always happens on that playground. Yeah. I would usually, as a parent, think about like, okay, was this an appropriate place for my kid to be? Were there adults around who are helping hold some level of safety and guidance? Was this an appropriate time for them to be there? And then I would probably help them build some skills around, what do you do when you're in a fight with your friend? What's the next step? How did that feel? What are you going to try tomorrow? And I think sometimes with tech, we go right to the tech being the problem. Like, if we just got rid of that group chat, all adolescent conflict would go away. Now,
which, I mean,
let's be clear. When the group chat is 30 kids, really, truly, getting rid of the group chat would be really helpful. But sometimes we talk to parents and it's like, well, it's actually just 2 or 3 of their best friends. Right. And what's playing out on this chat is also playing out in the hallways of school. So what I mean by that, Vanessa, is that there's this age of opportunity also for trial and error, making mistakes and building skills. Yep. The adolescent brain is built exquisitely to learn from experience and to try to figure out what I might do next. So there is, even in the roughest parts of parenting. Now, let's say that that argument did take place in a 50 kid group chat where they're trying to get everybody in 7th grade in it. It's like, that is not setting you up for success. It's hard to build the skill. Like, this sort of is beyond what you're capable of right now. But there is this opportunity to not take every single tech mishap as a sign that I'm a bad parent or you're a bad kid or we have to get rid of everything. But we're thinking about what skills. This is an opportunity to build skills. Okay. So that's on one side. And then there is a sort of, I think that we don't hear as much about some of the data on the good things that are happening for young people with their devices, especially as we look at older adolescents and we're thinking about things like participation in conversations that matter to them, creativity, contribution. And I think as parents, we can start building bridges between their digital interests and things that help them do what adolescents are just wired and built to do, which is to figure out, how do I contribute? Where do I belong? Do I matter? And so that sort of age of opportunity of thinking about, okay, my kid, all they want to do is watch YouTube videos. You know, I gave an example in the book where I was working with a family or talking with a family who's then like, well, what if we have them learn how to produce videos at the community media center? And they are learning how to contribute. They're also with their peers and they're around purposeful adults. And I think that is an interesting time for us to think about that. We one of the tools in our toolkits is purposeful boundaries. The answer is no. One of the tools in our toolkit is, it sounds like this is an opportunity to build skills. What are the skills that we need to practice in order to be successful in this space? And then this other opportunity is like, what transformative, awesome things do we want to do with digital media? And how can we plug young people in to experiences that have purposeful peers and adults around them so that we're what I call building bridges between their online worlds and their offline worlds. And we do see that these experiences are protective and can help young people thrive. So that's a more complicated path, but I think we can do it. I think that we can, at our very best, we can hold grave concern. We can be really clear-eyed about the harms. We haven't even talked about AI because you've done it and you're going to keep doing it. There's a lot to be worried about.
A whole episode on AI. I was like, if we start talking about AI, it's like we're done.
It's a whole nother thing. But we can hold real concern and we can acknowledge that extending and deepening a friendship in online spaces can be helpful. And we can hold that they are doing some cool and creative things and that we're not the worst parent in the world for letting them have even a little bit of tech. So I think that complicated path is messy. But as I look at the data, I'm comforted by the fact that the things that bubble to the top of what helps them thrive in 2025 is not that different. We've been studying adolescence for a long time, that purposeful boundaries, warm and caring connection with adults and opportunities to build skills is still really, really sort of the recipe that young people need. And the question is, when does tech help and when does it hurt?
Erin, this was such a great conversation. We're so happy to have you here. And to have built purposeful connection online, which we then extended on another tech platform virtually into another tech platform, which will be this podcast episode. We are beginning as we mean to go on. Thanks for all the work you do helping make sense of this very complex issue for parents and for kids.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks, obviously, for your work in the world.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.